guitar travellers, it's Rowan J. Parker here and welcome to another episode of Fusion Essentials, a series of lessons all about the art of jazz and fusion guitar. On this week's episode we're going to be taking a look at dominant chords and how to apply melodic minor scales on top of various sorts of dominant chords to create all those cool and funky sounds that you hear all the jazz and fusion greats use. So it should be a lot of fun. And by the end of the lesson you'll have a good grasp on exactly how to leverage these sounds in your own playing, we hope. Before we get into the lesson, I'd like to encourage you to have a look at my website, www.rowanjparker.com. Tons of cool guitar stuff on that site. I know I'm always forever plugging my site, but please do have a look because it's a good one. There's lots of free backing tracks, there's loads of lessons. You can get even more free stuff by subscribing to the site. Just stick your email address into the subscribe box, hit subscribe, and there's a whole smorgasbord of free guitar stuff awaiting you. You can also book Skype lessons through the website as well. Other ways of contacting me, I'm on SoundCloud, Rowan-Parker. Again, you can get all my backing tracks freely downloadable from there. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter if you're interested in that sort of thing. You can contact me that way as well. Alright, well without further ado, let's get into today's lesson, Fusion Essentials, using the melodic minor scale on top of dominant chords. Let's do it. Alright, let's buckle up for some theory here. Basically, when you solo over a dominant 7th chord, there's two things that dominant 7th chord can be. It can be what's called a true dominant chord, or what I would call an active dominant chord, or it can be what you might call a false dominant chord, or what I would call a passive dominant chord. And depending on which one it is, you have to treat it in one way or another. So let me just try and demystify this a little bit. Dominant 7th chords have a tendency to resolve down a 5th. So for instance, E7 wants to resolve to A major, or for that matter, A minor. Or it could even resolve to A7, it could resolve to another 7th chord. It doesn't really matter what tonality the chord resolves to, provided it resolves down a 5th, and then there'll be a nice satisfying sense of cadence. Now if your dominant chord does that, then it's what I call a true 5. That is, it is a functioning dominant chord. It resolves 5-1, the root goes down a 5th, and if it does, then you treat it in a particular way. Now there are other sorts of dominant chords that you get. So for instance, if I've got an F7 chord, you would expect that F7th chord, if it were a true 5, to resolve down a 5th to B flat, or B flat minor, or B flat 7. What about if the dominant chord resolves from, say, an F7 to an A minor? Well, I think you'll agree in that case that the 7th chord, the F7 chord, is not functioning like a true dominant chord because it doesn't resolve down a 5th. It resolves to another chord to which it's actually not related. So in that case, if that is the case, then I would call this a passive dominant chord, or a non-functioning dominant chord, in the sense that the dominant chord does not resolve down a 5th. So that is the key to understanding what's going on. So when we look at these chord progressions, we're going to have to determine whether the dominant chord is a true 5, functioning like a 5 chord, resolving 5-1, or it isn't, and that it doesn't resolve. And depending on which one it is, we'll treat it with one scale or the other. So I hope that's clear enough for our two sorts of dominant chords. Let's go on now and look at two different chord progressions, and we will do a little bit of analysis of both. Okay, here's chord progression number 1. Let's have a listen. Which is A minor 7, going to E7. It's actually E7, raise 9, raise 5 if you must know, but it's fundamentally it's E7. So we've got to ask ourselves, first of all, in that chord progression, does the E7 chord resolve down a 5th to its 1 chord? And the answer to that is yes, clearly it does. E7 resolves down a perfect 5th to A minor. So in that case, in this chord progression, the dominant chord is a true 5. That is, it is a functioning dominant chord resolving down 5-1. Okay, so that's chord progression number 1. Let's look at chord progression number 2 now. Chord progression number 2 is A minor 7. Going to F7. Actually F9 or 13 or sharp 11, but it's fundamentally it's F7. So the question is, does the F7th chord resolve down a perfect 5th to its 1? And the answer to that is obviously no, it doesn't. Because if it did, it would be resolving to some sort of B flat chord, B flat major or B flat minor or B flat 7, and it isn't doing that, it's going back to the A minor chord. So it's pretty obvious in that case that the F7 chord is not a true 5, it's not a functioning dominant chord, it's what I would call a passive dominant chord. Alright, so I think that makes it clear that on our two chord progressions, the first dominant chord, the E7, is a true 5, and we're going to treat that in one way, and in our second chord progression, the F7 is not a true 5, and we're going to treat that differently. Alright, so now let's look at which scales we're going to use to play over these two different sorts of dominant chords. So let's look at our first chord progression, which contained this chord, which is E7 sharp 9 sharp 5, otherwise known as an altered dominant chord because it has alterations to the 5th and the 9th. What scale can you use to play over this? Well, the most commonly used scale in jazz and fusion to play over altered dominant chords is called Super Locrian, which is also known as the diminished whole tone scale, and it's sometimes also called the altered scale to fit in with the altered chord. Now, the easiest way to think about some of these complicated sounding scales is relate them parentally to whichever melodic minor scale they belong. So, E Super Locrian is actually the 7th mode of F melodic minor. So fundamentally, E Super Locrian just is F melodic minor. So here's our first little rule to extract. If we're playing on top of a dominant chord, which is a true 5, that is, it resolves 5-1, our first little rule is play the melodic minor scale up 1 semitone. Let's just clarify that by changing the key. Let's say it was a C7 sharp 9 chord. Then what melodic minor scale would you use? You would use the one a semitone up, i.e. D flat melodic minor. So it's really as simple as that. If you know that your chord is a true 5, use the melodic minor scale up a semitone. This is called parental thinking, and for melodic minor scales it's particularly useful. If you want to learn more about it, I suggest you investigate the jazz player Pat Martino, who uses this system called minor conversion, which I find incredibly useful. It's also known in a different guise as the Lydian chromatic concept of tonal organisation, which sounds amazingly complicated, but what it really boils down to is think relatively or parentally, and for some of these more advanced scales that's particularly useful. So what then are our scale choices over our first chord progression, which was A minor 7 and then E7 sharp 9? Well, over A minor 7 I'm just going to play A Dorian because it's the most obvious scale to play on my A minor 7 chord. And then over E7 sharp 9 I'm going to do my F melodic minor thing, which as you can see sounds particularly dark, and we just play backwards and forwards between those two scales or modes. So I think at this point we'll give you a little playing demonstration of me soloing over A minor 7 for 2 bars and then E7 sharp 9 for 2 bars, and we can hear these two contrasting sounds as I switch between A Dorian and then the F melodic minor scale over the E7. Alright, so here we go for playing demo number 1. Let's have a listen. Very brief, but I think you get the idea of the lightness of A Dorian going to the darkness of the melodic minor of the E Super Locrian and the resolving back. And this sound is fantastic for getting darker sounds into your playing and hearing the resolution of darkness to lightness. Okay, so let's go on and look at the second chord progression, how to deal with that one. Okay, let's examine our second chord progression now. A minor 7 and then fundamentally F7. In this case I'm using F9 just for a bit of colour. So we've already learned that this F7 chord is not a true functioning 5. It doesn't resolve down 5-1, so I would call this a passive dominant chord. If it's a passive dominant chord which does not resolve down a fifth, then you play this scale or mode on top of it. We're going to play a scale called Lydian dominant. Now, Lydian dominant is another mode of melodic minor. It is mode 4 of melodic minor. So if we play F Lydian dominant over our F7 chord, the question is, what melodic minor scale is it related to parentally? So we just need to go back down the scale from the 4th degree down to the 1st, and if we do that, we'll discover that the parent melodic minor scale is C. It's C melodic minor. So a thinking process that you could engage in would be to think, alright, F7, that's mode 4 of C melodic minor. Just going back a fourth. Ways to quickly figure out which parental melodic minor scale it is, because you need to think a little bit more. Here's a suggestion. If it's F7 and that were the 5 chord, what would its 2 chord be? If you want to play a 2-5 and F7 was the 5, what would the 2 be? And the 2 would be C minor. C minor 7 F7. So that's a quick and easy way of figuring out which melodic minor scale to use. Just think, if that were a 5, what would its 2 be? And that will give you the right answer. Okay, so soloing over this chord progression now. A minor 7 going to F9. We'll be using A Dorian over our A minor 7, and then F Lydian dominant or C melodic minor over the F7. So let's give you a little playing demonstration of that then. Okay, so that one again, very interesting. You can hear Lydian dominant is not quite as dark as Super Locrian, but again, a very funky and interesting sound on the dominant chord. Alrighty, well, I think what I'll do is one last demonstration is give you combinations of using both of these scales. So let's do this chord progression. We'll do A minor 7, and then we'll go to D7, and then we'll go to F9, and then we'll go to E7 sharp 9, and back to A minor. And briefly through the scales, A Dorian for A minor 7. For the D9, I could also use A Dorian, but I might be tempted to use D Lydian dominant, which would be A melodic minor, up to F9, that's our good old buddy C melodic minor, and then E7 sharp 9 is F melodic minor. So my thinking process is something like this: A minor, C minor, F minor. That's how I'm converting all the chords into their related parent scales, and that's what I'm thinking about as I'm improvising. Alright, so let's demo that then. Concludes this episode of Fusion Essentials. I hope you found it interesting and you're starting to see how we can use these melodic minor scales to create some very interesting sounds. Now, if you want to pursue this sort of playing further, then I'll be doing a full-length video which will be for sale on my website very shortly, all about the use of melodic minor for improvisation, because we're only scratching the surface here of the things you can do with this wonderful scale. So I'll catch you next time for another episode of Fusion Essentials. We're going to be looking at a subject called pentatonic superimposition, which sounds very complicated but actually is quite straightforward. So until then, farewell and keep jazzing. Goodbye.